Welcome, folks there on Zoom. Hopefully everybody is doing well. We've got some people in the classroom here too. Thanks for being with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about our purchase agreement, though things will probably change on our purchase agreement because we're talking to the attorney right now. There are a few things we have to update on it, just because commissions are 100% negotiable. and they're not set by law, so we have to have that in there. Some other things that we're going to clarify are the we're going to add a definition in there for what does a complete inspection mean? Because right now we have it upon the inspection being completed that you have 3 days to do the ROC, and some brokerages or agents think, oh, well, that's as soon as the inspection's done. And no, it's not. It's when you actually get the information that you need back. That's when it's done. Yeah. It's the last inspection. That's exactly right. And so that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we clarify for people. And we're going to see if my computer will pass to this because usually it doesn't want to. But you guys can print the purchase script for me if we need to.
Yeah, I have a question. When we do the ROC, like sometimes we didn't get repairs moving on a general inspection, maybe the septic or well or a pest inspection has not been completed yet. Is there a way that we can have it where it doesn't say like police said inspection contingencies? We can have it where these aren't released yet. This is released.
Well, so Scott, for those of you on Zoom, is asking the question basically, if we have other inspections that are completed, would we be able to go ahead and just release some of the inspections, but not all of them? And the answer is there are some brokerages that choose to do that. And I will say, we don't recommend doing that because we only have one ROC typically. You don't have 5 of them. And so it gets a little confusing when you're releasing things. And the other thing I would say about that is, yeah, this is not going to work. So I can print this for you guys. I'll print the purchase agreement for you because it's not going to work on the TV. Not only does it get confusing if you have more than one ROC, however, I know that if you've ever been in a seller's position, if you have somebody keep coming back to you after every inspection, or even like you think that, let's say there was a general home inspection and now you're waiting on the septic and well, but you negotiated to have radon repaired or mitigated, and you negotiated to have other things, and the seller's like, oh, I think that's all. And now you come back to them because there's a septic and well problem. And now you come back to them because there's a pest inspection problem. It gets to be a lot, and a seller wants to know, at least if you put yourself in the seller position, you're going to know the full picture before you agree or disagree to do anything. And that's the biggest thing. So I would say, no, I cannot see us getting to a point where we would have more than one ROC.
And I'll still ready. This is police. That's all I'm looking for, because I want the repairs not to delay things. Right now, you get people like nobody's available to do the repairs, so that's why I'm asking. Or for the general.
Yeah. So if people are, so just so you guys are aware on Zoom, so what Scott's asking is, so there's a lot of times where you want something repaired, but a person is not available to actually get it repaired. And that's frustrating. It's very frustrating, simply because you have so many contractors out there, and unfortunately, they either take their good old time or it puts you beyond the date that you're allowed to be for the ROC. So I certainly understand how frustrating it is. But again, releasing them, unfortunately, is not the best thing to do, just simply because the seller would say, again, you may not be able to get them repaired, but I don't have all of the information I need to make an educated decision. So you can try and write on there and say the other ones are not released or these are released. But what I would say typically is if I can't get somebody to do the work on time, we either escrow it or we pay for it at closing, and then that way it's done and the buyer can have it done after the fact.
You get the sheets.
Yeah. Give me 1 second.
The other issue will be when you have appraisal, HA or VA that calls repairs.
Yes. Yes, well, that's true.
Invoices from the professional, we asked for things to be done professionally on ROC. And so he sent over like it's like he took his phone and typed up the repairs on like a notes, and then the professional was out of invoices, so the professional signed his name to that like in a like with a pen from the phone, so it's like this weird. And then I got screenshots of that as proof. I'm like, well, first of all, not even everything he asked for is included on that list. Secondly, what about the stuff that So they're like, promise you didn't do it himself. I'm like, well, then just send us the invoice.
It comes up a lot. So those of you on Zoom, I can share with you. So what Lynette was saying is a lot of times when you're negotiating the ROC and we put on there that, Scott, let me know how many of that printed and I can print more. It's basically you want it done by a professional and then you get receipts that don't have a professional on them. No, I'm good. How many copies did it print? Do you know? Okay. Just let me know if I need to print more. But at any rate, yes, it is a problem because when you say done by a licensed professional or a professional, and that you want the receipts and then you get something that is handwritten or on notebook paper or whatever, it is very frustrating. Yes, it can be. So I certainly understand that. Guys, we're going to get started here on Zoom here in just a few minutes. We're just printing a couple copies of the purchase agreement because our my computer does not want to cast the TV for some reason. Throws fits. But we'll go ahead and if you want to pull up, I should be sharing the screen. Can everybody see the purchase agreement on Zoom? Is that the screen that you see? Anybody? Can anybody on Zoom hear me? Well, let's see. I got a chat. No. Okay. There's a block over it. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
This one. You can do mine.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Can you now see the purchase agreement on Zoom? Good now. Okay, good. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, everybody. All right, that's better. Perfect. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I will say, like I said, the purchase agreement, we are going to have some minor changes to it coming up, but nothing too crazy. But the first thing I would say is for the permanent parcel number that's on line 1, you always want to make sure that you're not trusting what the listing agent has in the MLS. You want to make sure that the permanent parcel number that you believe is supposed to be transferring is written in there, but also there can be more than one. There can be 3, 4, 5, it depends on how many parcels. The important thing is that you write it on there simply because if you're porting over the information from the MLS, it may not bring over more than one parcel number. And I've actually seen parcels transfer where there are 2 lots and they're supposed to go and only one transfers, or the agent transfers 2 lots because that's what they put on the purchase agreement and really only 1 lot was supposed to. So whether you're on the listing side or the purchase side, you want to make sure that the permanent parcel number that you actually have written in there is correct, whether it's 1 or multiple. All right. And then the address and the county in which the property is located on line 2. And then the purchase price would be on line 3. Any earnest money deposit would go on line 4. Typically, we like to see around $500. It's great if you can do more. I would always tell you that the more earnest money that you can put down and the more of the down payment on line 8 that you can show, the stronger your buyer is actually going to look to the listing side. So if I get a purchase agreement and somebody has not filled out the balance of the down payment or even earnest money if they're giving 500, but I have somebody else that's giving 2,000, it makes a big difference sometimes to the seller because they know that there is now somebody that is very interested in moving forward no matter what with their property, even through inspections. When you're putting down a larger amount, that means you're probably going to move forward and not back out, whereas $500 is very slim. For veterans, for VA buyers, you do not have to have earnest money. There's nothing that says that you have to have earnest money on any transaction. You do not have to, but VA, a lot of times, because they're doing 100% financing, you don't get the earnest money. Sometimes you can get somebody to put $500 or so down, but not terribly often. And then in line 7, that's where the title company would go that you're working with, that you intend to work with or are negotiating for the buyer and seller to agree on. And that's who's going to hold the earnest money. And then again, line 8, balance of the down payment due. And then line 9, which is the amount to be financed. That's the amount that they are financing with their mortgage company. So if, for example, we had the purchase price was $300,000. And then I had, let's say, $10,000 earnest money, which we don't see too often, but let's just say we do. And then we're going to have, let's say the person is putting down another $290,000. I'm sorry, $90,000. And so they're only financing then $200,000. because our other two has made up the 100,000, and so they're financing 200,000. So that is an example of what you would do. They should all add up. I oftentimes will put on line 8.2 if it's a percentage. So if my client's putting down 5%, I might just write 5%. I might not put whatever the amount is. I might just put the percentage, because oftentimes when you go back and forth and you're negotiating the price, that can change, and so it's more boxes to change. But it definitely shows how secure your buyer is in the financing that they have. And you should know that, by the way. If you're working with a buyer, especially where we're going in today's market, you should absolutely have an idea of how much money that the buyer is putting down on their loan. If you don't, you're not doing your job, in my opinion. Tara?
He was a loan officer, and she suggested to me lines 8 and 9 are none of our businesses are, and real estate agents are filled. So she told me that I have to update it to be determined.
Yeah. So Tara's sharing with us that she has seen agents or have had to put in to be determined on lines 8 and 9 because a particular lender in her case said that it was none of the agent's business how much the client was putting down. And I would say, I don't know how long that lender has been in the business, but as a seller, it is absolutely my business to know whether or not that buyer is adequately been pre-approved, first of all, and how much money do they actually have to put down? Because I may say, well, maybe we're in a multiple offer situation and I have somebody that's putting 3.5% down because they're doing an FHA, or maybe it's a 1% down conventional. Let's do that. Let's say that as an example. You see conventional, because we all know that FHA is going to be 3.5%. But let's say we have two conventional offers. One is a 1% down and one is 20% down. Well, I'm probably going to be more apt to go with the 20% down because I know that buyer is much more secure. I don't have to worry so much about appraisal issues or gaps or anything like that. Whereas the 1% down, we might have some trouble there. It just depends. So I do not believe that lender has either worked in the industry long enough or she hasn't had any pushback. He or she hasn't had pushback, because why they think that would be none of our business as agents or a seller is beyond me.
Me feel uncomfortable running that contract after filled out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I can guarantee most of the, I see we have 17 people on Zoom. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 people in the room here. I can say, if you've ever gotten a purchase agreement that is halfway filled out, what's the first thought you have in your head? Yep. Lazy agent, doesn't know what they're doing. Yeah. Or doesn't represent their buyers well. That's all of us. And I think that that's common. So I would say the better you can fill out this purchase agreement, in my opinion, the much better it is for your client. So, yep. And then the financing, it just says that the buyer is going to make a written loan application within 5 days, excluding weekends and holidays, federal holidays. And then we'll have a loan commitment on line 13. Typically, so however long you're going to close, let's say you have 45-day close, then I would say that you only want to put in here within 40 days. I always try and make it within a 5 to 10 day deadline from the time that you're going to close. So if I know I'm going to close in 45 days, then I'm going to put 40 days in here for a loan commitment. This is not something in our market that we really look at a lot or do anything with, but it is important in the Cleveland market. They will hold you to making sure that you actually have loan commitment by the time that you say you're going to, because these dates matter and they mean something. So that's typically, like I said, 5 to 10 days between your close date.
The seller wanted to get out, and they try to look at those things and try to, assuming we missed those deadlines. And fortunately, everything's been hit, but they wanted out of the deal.
Yeah. So to Lynette's point, she said she had a seller that wanted to try and get out of a deal because they may not have had loan commitment in that time frame. One of the things I will tell you is that's oftentimes that can be the case. However, in our contract, our purchase agreement does not say time is of the essence, which means if you let one thing go, you can't then go back and say, oh, well, we're going to hold you to this one. So for example, if we said we had 40 days in there for loan commitment, but we gave 10 days to do inspections, and we still allowed the buyer to do inspections on day 14 and 15, well, now you're not following the contract. You're both have a meeting of the minds. You both are moving forward with your best interest, which is good. However, you can't then as a seller come back and say, well, I didn't enforce that date, but I'm going to enforce this date. That would be a problem legally. The attorneys would not be able to defend us for that. So you want to make sure that if you're holding up dates, you make sure that you hold up all the dates and not just what the seller wants. Yep. Okay. Line 19, we haven't had to see this. We haven't seen this in quite a while. a seller agrees to pay blank towards buyer's expenses and closing costs. Now, we will probably start to see this again very much because we are, I would imagine, having agents trying to get some of their commission covered, which means that buyers would say, hey, I want you to write in there $5,000 or $8,000, whatever it is, in concessions, because I don't really want to have to pay you. I want the seller to pay you. And this is how I'm going to do it, is through the concessions. So one of the things, I was over at Jose's office this morning, and he had a team meeting, and I was talking to them a little bit about this. One of the things I'll say, when you're writing this now for a seller agrees to pay blank on the purchase agreement, so we're going to call it $5,000. I'm going to write $5,000 in there. What I don't know at this point is where you're going to see that on the settlement statement, the ULTA, right? Because if it is in fact for commissions, perhaps, let's say that's what it's for in this example, I'm not sure yet if the title company is going to give the buyer a $5,000 credit on their settlement statement, and then you will see your commission on the ULTA for the buyer, or if in fact they are going to leave it on the seller side, $5,000 being paid to Keller Williams. We're not sure how we're going to see that yet. So I will tell you, no matter what number you put on line 19, you do want to make sure that you're probably getting settlement statements that are joint and not just for the seller or the buyer, if the title company will share them with you. And to my knowledge, there's nothing illegal about that. I've been shared many of those over the years, and they don't often do it unless you request it. Either way, if they won't share it, that's fine. You need to make sure that the commission that you're being paid or the concessions that the buyer is getting is either on the seller side or on the buyer side. Somehow you need to verify that with the title company. Okay. All right. And then line 24 is actually for FHA and VA buyers. That is in the event that we need any repairs done. So I typically, if I'm working with a VA or FHA buyer, I do typically put in $250 to $500 on that line. Whether we're going to need it or not, I'm not really sure. But if I go into a house that I can see has chipped and peeling paint, maybe it has broken windows, maybe there's no handrails, maybe there's no GFCI outlets, things like that, things that you most likely realize are going to be called out for. That's why I put a number in there. But if I put $500 in there and all of a sudden repairs from the appraiser come back at $1,000, unfortunately, that extra $500 is 100% negotiable, because I know the seller is willing to cover $500 because that's what I wrote in there. But the other $500 to make up the $1,000 could come from the buyer. It could come from the seller. It could come from the agents. But you never want to leave that blank. And I've had agents say, well, we're going to leave that blank or to be determined. If you put to be determined in there, kudos to you if you're the buyer's agent. But at the same time, if you're the listing agent, if you accept to be determined, that can mean a lot of different things. That could mean zero, right? Because the seller doesn't have to agree, it's to be determined. Or it could be writing a blank check for your seller saying it's $5,000 worth of repairs because the whole outside of the house needs repainted. So I don't ever think that to be determined is in there, but I've had plenty of agents say, well, we just put it to be determined because we don't know. Well, you don't know a lot of things yet because we haven't had the appraiser out. And the seller is maybe thinking, oh, to be determined. Oh, okay, we'll decide that when that comes. And in your mind, you might be thinking, oh, well, if I write to be determined in there, that's a blank check for the seller. So what you think and what the seller thinks, or the buyer's agent and listing agent think, could be totally different. So I always say write a number in there. Don't leave it blank. And certainly don't put to be determined in there. Okay. All right. Fixtures and equipment. So we have changed this over the years. I will tell you, if you look at the Columbus Board of Realtors contract, their contract is 14 pages long because they cover so many things in there, especially with fixtures and equipment. But basically what you need to know is anything that's attached to the house, including curtain rods, garage door opener, smart cameras, doorbells, anything like that. If it's attached to the property with some kind of nail or a screw, typically it belongs with the property. Now, things that would be excluded would be personal possession. So, even though like in this room, this picture is hanging on nails, I can take that off because it's hanging on the nail. But if it were screwed into the wall with screws, it's pretty secure. That's a little bit different than me just hanging it on a nail. But I bring that up because we've had instances where, bathroom mirrors, they are just hung on the wall and they don't have a border around them anymore, or they're not glued to the wall. And so sometimes people will take those. They're supposed to leave TV mounts Not always do they do that. Why are they supposed to leave them? Because it leaves a huge hole in the wall oftentimes. So those are the kinds of things you just kind of walk through the house with people and make sure that your buyer understands. These are the things that should stay. These are the things that shouldn't stay. And it's always negotiable. So we have plenty of things in there. And you can check those boxes. But I will also tell you, be careful, because just because it lists the washer and dryer in the MLS or the stove and refrigerator, if you don't actually check that on the purchase agreement, again, everything is negotiable. The purchase agreement is going to supersede whatever's in the MLS. Okay. And I can tell you, any of us that have been in the business for a while, probably even longer than a year, we have all paid for or partially paid for a refrigerator, a washer and dryer, a home warranty, something to be repaired. It happens, and it will happen to you. It's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. Mm. So Tara has a question. If somebody wrote in the contract, all appliances shown in the MLS, I suppose that you could. Yeah, I suppose you could say that. I think that oftentimes, though, when you say shown in the MLS, does that mean the picture of the actual appliance that you see? Or does it mean because you listed a refrigerator in the MLS, right? So I think that, I mean, that could be a gray area. So I think, in my opinion, like you'll see on here, we actually have kitchen refrigerator, because there have been often times where a house has multiple refrigerators and a seller will just say, well, I'm taking my kitchen refrigerator, but I'm bringing up the one from the basement and it looks disgusting and it's dirty, but that's the one I said I was leaving. So that's why we have kitchen refrigerator on there, because it has become a problem. Not often do we have that with a stove or a dishwasher or anything like that. So Tara, I wouldn't necessarily think that that's appropriate to say, all appliances listed in MLS, because it, again, could be a gray area. Yeah, the MLS was 100% editable. So, not that you couldn't prove that it was changed later, but yes, certainly. You'll see that on the bottom of our purchase agreement, and most all of the purchase agreements at the bottom of every page, is buyer's initials, but that does not mean that they have to initial. We require it as part of our purchase agreement. And unfortunately, though, I will tell you, if you get into different areas, so like, for example, I think going out towards Mansfield, they actually have a broker out there that if we sent them our purchase agreement, they will send back a one-page document that's a counteroffer addendum. And basically it says, the seller is willing to accept all of the terms of your agreement as written on this date, whatever, with the exception of blank, and whatever that exception is. That's the only page they sign, and that constitutes the purchase agreement being signed. There's nothing in contract law that says that you have to initial and date at the bottom of every page. And we learned that the hard way, because I argued with a broker for a while, that particular broker, and said, but you have to, it's on our purchase agreement. And then we called Ohio Realtor Attorneys and they said, no, that's not true. There's nothing in the statutes of fraud or contract law that says that you have to do that. So just in case you run into that for any particular reason, I'm throwing it out there now that don't have that argument. If you have a document that is signed, even if, let's just say, for example, the buyer's initials, they didn't initial or the seller didn't initial, but they signed on the last page, that could be a gray area, but it could actually be used in court too, to say that the seller or buyer did agree to it. Now, I'm not telling you to use that practice. You always want to make sure if there's a change, you have it initialed by your buyer or seller, and always try and get them to initial at the bottom of the page. But it's not worth having the argument with another brokerage if they don't, if you get that one-page addendum. Okay, because it could also be a very gray area if you change something here and somebody doesn't initial it. Did we really agree to it? Right. So make sure you do your due diligence and protect your consumer. Always get initials next to any change as much as you humanly possibly can. Okay. All right. And then we'll move on to page 2. So that just continues on. I've got the large print purchase agreement up here so that people on Zoom can see it. So if you've got the original one, you can follow along. And if not, we're on line 45. So that's the second page.
Just because it comes up a lot. The other good thing is the additional 14 days.
For the financing.
Asking us to write an extension, we don't have to.
Most contracts I before.
Yeah.
About.
Yeah. The words matter, whether it's about, on, or before, or on that day, for sure. Scott was just saying that, he likes in our purchase agreement during the financing paragraph I'm sorry, the second paragraph where it says financing 11 through 33, it just gives an extra 14 days. If there's no fault through the buyer, that they delayed a closing, that we automatically have that 14 days built in there. I would say don't always depend on that, still do an extension if necessary. But we do have that built in 14 days, and that's only really good if it's a lender problem, not necessarily a buyer problem. If the buyer waited 10 days to fill out their application, or the buyer didn't get their docs in, we might have a different problem. But if it's really a lender issue, there is a possibility that the 14 days will cover. Yep.
About that.
Michael?
So let's just say you do an addendum.
Mhm.
And the new close date, does that 14 days extend beyond that new close date, or is it based off the original one?
Yeah, so technically, so Michael's question is, if you do an addendum and you extend the close date, then do you still have 14 days after that close date technically? And the answer would be yes, because it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. All you changed was that date, the closing date. You didn't change the 14 days or anything else in the contract. Everything else stayed the same. I will tell you that that is how we understand it. That's what an attorney would say. And we've had that question before. However, that does not mean that a listing broker would agree with us or a seller would agree with us and not just go rogue and do what they want to do. So that's why I would say, even though there are some built-in fail safes in here, always try and get an extension as much as you can. You know, even if you have a listing and the listing is under contract and it's going to expire, I still get a listing extension instead of letting it go pending expired in the MLS. It's just really good to keep all your dates together so that you know what's going on in the contract, and more importantly, the lender, the title company, and the buyer and the seller. Yeah.
Verbiage, it's not just a date. So
Yeah.
you have the verbiage of to close on or before, to close on or about.
Yeah.
Again, right then.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, all the other terms remain the same with the exception of whatever you change in the addendum. So, yeah. All right, and then so on page 2, fixtures that would not be included. I mean, typically there are not too many things that are not included in a real estate sale that are fixtures. However, I have seen times where a dining room chandelier was somebody's grandmother's, sister's, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever, and they want to take it with them. Now, when I go in to list the property, I always recommend when we take a picture of this house, whatever is excluded, get rid of it before we actually take the pictures, because you can't imagine how many times, or you can imagine how many times, you know, whether it's a fountain, whether it's a light fixture, whatever it is, a ring doorbell, whatever it is that the buyer sees, they automatically perceive that that is staying with the property. And so it's the same thing, you know, with it, if it's theater equipment or things like that, we've had problems where it says there's a whole house theater system or there's speakers throughout the house. Well, the seller, we advertised it as such, but the seller's like, well, yeah, the speakers that are built into the walls are staying, but my Sonos speakers that I take with me outside, or they're mounted outside or whatever, I'm taking those with me. And it's like, well, you need to exclude those things. So when you're writing an offer these days with all the technology that we have, make sure that you really are including any kind of technology that you expect to stay with the property, or it's not. If it's not, you know, just because it's written in the MLS that something's not staying, again, the purchase agreement is going to supersede that. So, okay. All right. And then deed and closing. So we define in our purchase agreement what closing is. Closing is actually the date of the recording of the deed. I will tell you on our new purchase agreement, that will not be there. And it's simply because these days, post-COVID world, we have addendums that are being signed that the title company has actually produced, or their attorneys have produced, that say that basically once we have the funds from the buyer and we have the funds from the lender and everything, even if we haven't dispersed the money to the seller, to the realtors, or anybody like that, we've taken in all of the money and we have taken our paperwork downtown to be recorded, we are considering it's recorded. Whether it's recorded or not is irrelevant in their eyes, but we are getting more and more headaches because our contract actually says the date of recording, which I do appreciate, and I'll take your feedback on that too, but I do appreciate it. But at the same time, I can now see why it's being a detriment to our sellers and or our buyers, simply because if the title company is sending an email that says, consider this funded and recorded and everything's done, a seller's like, well, I don't have my money yet. I don't want to give up the keys. Well, this can stop them from giving up their keys, which is great when we are on the listing side. But when we're on the buyer's side, and the seller says, oh, well, I'm not giving my keys because now it's not recorded. I can't see it online. It's not being recorded till Monday or Tuesday, which doesn't often happen, but it can. It hurts us. So I will just say, I don't know if you guys have any feedback with that, but not all purchase agreements have that definition in there of when the closing, what closing means. And so closing in the eyes of real estate is basically when the title company says it's filed, it's funded and considered filed, that's it. When you've turned all your money over and they have everything that they need, all the signatures, you are technically closed. Okay. So that will be coming out, but as of now, we're training on it, still in there. And then the deed to be made payable to, find out who that's going to be. I mean, when you're working with your buyers, is it, just because you call them Bob, is his name Robert? People call me Rich. My real name is Richard. I might want it in my legal name, and find out, is there a spouse? Is there somebody else that's going on that deed, and can they? Because there are some times where you have a married couple who, in fact, only one of them is allowed on the loan, the other one is not, but they can both be on the deed. You just never know. So you just need to make sure that you're asking that question and finding out who is supposed to be on the deed. That includes sometimes asking the lender, not just the buyer. So, right. And then possession. This came up the other day, which I thought was interesting. We had two of our agents. One understood the contract, one didn't understand the contract. And possession says, seller agrees to deliver possession to buyer on or before 4 p.m. That is, on or before 4 p.m. means whether it is on the date of closing or however many days after closing. That sentence in the first part says on or before 4 p.m. It doesn't distinguish the difference between whether you're getting possession the day of closing or 5 days after closing. It is still on or before 4 o'clock. So just make sure you understand that if you have a seller, or if you're on the buy side, as we are with the purchase agreement, that your buyer should get the keys on or before 4 p.m. the day of whatever it is that we're either recording or the possession. Not 6 o'clock that night, not 10 o'clock that night. It's supposed to be on or before 4 p.m. And I'll tell you, the reason that came up is because we actually had clients that were moving from Texas to Ohio, and they had already left. I mean, that's quite a drive in a U-Haul with 2 dogs in their vehicle. They had stayed in multiple hotels. They were coming into town. They wanted their keys. They wanted in their house. They were not real happy when they got to Belden Village and had to get another hotel because, unfortunately, the seller said, I won't be out until 8 o'clock tonight. I mean, there's nothing on, that was before we had this in the contract. There's nothing on the purchase agreement that says what time I have to be out. It just says I have to give you possession on the 10th day. Well, they thought they were getting it at 8 o'clock in the morning when they arrived, and the seller thought they were giving it at 8 o'clock that night. So 4 o'clock is in our purchase agreement. Be cognizant and aware of other purchase agreements, because you don't want to be on that side when your seller says, I can't get out by then. And you're like, well, you have to be out. So, right.
And that's assuming that it's been recorded, or it's been the title company since.
Yeah, that's assuming that the title company has said that it's been recorded or is down at in their eyes, recorded. Yes. Yep. Yep. And then evidence of title. So line 63 and line 66, 67, that's going to be the same company. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Michael.
No, sorry, possession on, or you say the second day after closing. Is the first, you count the day of closing as the first day, or do you count the next day?
Yeah, you do not count. So Michael's question is, do you count the day of closing? Is that considered one day? And the answer is no. There is nothing that outlines that, but I will tell you, as a practice, a standard of practice, at least here, we do not count today. If we closed on a house, that today is day number 1, tomorrow is day number 1, then the next day. We do not count today of the day of closing, simply because it may have closed today, but you didn't have a full day. So if we want to talk full days, if it recorded at noon, then tomorrow at noon is actually 1 day, right? So yes. I don't know if anybody else has ran into that. I feel like that's a common practice that we have. But to your point, you don't want to misrepresent the number of days, because that can happen to where a buyer's agent does think that today is 1 day and it counts. And then you'll say, well, yeah, you closed today. This is one day of them having possession. Well, they might not have signed until 4 o'clock in the afternoon for all we know. So it does not count, but that could really throw off your seller when they have that moving truck coming. So yeah, good question. Yep. All right. And then evidence of title. So line 63, 66, 67, that is going to be whatever title company you're using. There can be a difference between the escrow agent or escrow company and the company that is issuing the actual title policy. Not often does that happen, but I will say at Remax Edge, they do have that. They have Colonial Title does one portion of it, and Blue Ridge Title does a second portion of it. You'll see that in their purchase agreement. It's in the same building. You're not going to notice a difference, but oftentimes it can cost a buyer or seller a little bit more money simply because you have two different title companies doing some of the work. Sometimes a title company, now again, they're affiliated, they're in the same building, fine. But let's say you decided to have American Title do the title work and you're going to have some other title company do the escrow for whatever the reason you would say. Sometimes the other company won't do the escrow because they didn't do the title work, so they have to make sure that since they're the ones actually closing it, can they trust the other title company that did the title work and make sure that they're doing escrow properly. Sometimes they won't do that. So often, though, you don't normally see a difference in two different title companies. But the title company, the one thing I'll say is don't ever lose a deal over title company. I know that we have ABAs with companies and things like that. It's not worth the argument. It is just not worth it. And by the way, it is up to the buyer and seller what title companies we use. It is not up to us. I know there are agents out there and we combat them every single day and we're on a losing battle that will call you up and say, oh, well, the sellers want to use this title company because they've used them in the past or it's in the MLS, even though you're not allowed to do that. It's a problem, but it's 100% negotiable. But there are some very persuasive agents that will get you to side with them. And at the end of the day, as long as it's a reputable title company that you've dealt with before or somebody that you know, I don't really see a reason to argue over the title company. So
you can't put in the MLS for the title agency.
Yeah.
Can we put the document there to sign?
Yeah, so you can put, so the question Tara had is when you what you can't put in the MLS, what my statement is, you can't put in there American Title's already started the title work or seller prefers to use American Title. You can't say that. But if you have the ABA document uploaded to the supplements, you are allowed to do that. And I do encourage you to do that because you're more apt to get a buyer's agent and a buyer to agree to using that title company if the ABA is right there because it suggests to them that that's who you want to use or the seller wants to use, and they will send over the offer with that. So it is nice. Title, one of the things I do want to share is if you are not a member of American Title Solutions, that's fine. You might have another title company that you want to use. However, because Keller Williams Legacy Group is, in fact, we get money quarterly that helps towards your profit share and paying the bills and things like that. We are affiliated with American Title Solutions. So that means that even if you yourself as an agent or a team are not, your buyer client still has to sign the ABA that is sent over because we are affiliated and they're using Keller Williams and American Title. That's only if they're using American Title. If they're not, you don't have to do that. But I did have an agent ask that question, and the answer is yes, you have to. Yep. All right. And then one other thing I'll point out there is we have in our purchase agreement a title insurance commitment for an Alta homeowners title policy. I won't go into what the difference is between an Alta title policy and a homeowner's title policy, but the homeowner's title policy is more expensive. We have chosen to do that for our clients. It's not often argued, but I have had other title companies that will say, hey, I've talked to the buyer and they don't want a homeowner's title policy because they don't want to split the cost of that. That's the most expensive cost is the title insurance, right? It's split between buyer and seller, but it is expensive. And so they'll say, or the seller doesn't want to pay that. Well, the seller already agreed to it. And so did the buyer. If they agree to change it, fine. But I would say talk to American Title. They can distinguish the difference between the Alta and the homeowner's title policy. But it gives them the extra coverage after closing for a few items that would not be covered in just a regular Alta title policy. Okay. So be aware that not all purchase agreements have that in there, right? So we are one of the companies that does that. Okay. And then taxes, utilities, and notices. So the seller is responsible for the taxes and utilities up until the very day of closing, as we're aware. But sometimes they do not know that. I actually had a seller one time that said, oh, we would have never accepted that offer if we knew that we had to pay for our utilities after closing and we're living here for the next 30 days. And I said, well, I don't know of any landlord that pays the tenants' utility bills. perhaps a water and sewer bill, but not your electric and gas and all that stuff. So the biggest thing to remember here is that in a municipality that has public water and sewer, typically, not always, but typically that runs with the property. And that's why we have that on line 84 shall hold blank towards pending receipts. Typically, we see about $250 in there. $250 sometimes may not even come close to a seller that hasn't paid their water sewer bill in months and months and months. They might have a $600 bill and a shutoff notice that we're unaware of. Title does look for it most of the time, not always. Not all title companies do that, so you do want to be careful. That's why we went ahead and put it back in our contract. It was not in there years ago. I think Howard Hanna is the only other one I've seen that in. Remax might, but nonetheless, we put it back in there because it was becoming a problem because they do run with the property. So if you close on a property and there's a $600 bill due, you just inherited that $600 bill unless you're going to take the seller to court and get them to pay it. Now, in Stark County, there are plenty of places. So like the townships, so like example, Jackson Township here, we have Aqua Ohio Water. That runs off your social security number, just like your electric and your gas does. But if you're in Canton City, Akron City, Massillon City, I don't know about Navarre, but those all run Louisville. They all run with you as the owner and the property. So as soon as you transfer that property, you are the new person responsible for those bills. So if you have questions about that, you can always call the title company and make sure that they're checking. Yep.
I know American South.
Yeah.
Yeah, we recently had. Sure, because I didn't. I talked to my
Yeah.
buyers. Assume that responsibility.
Yeah.
Or potentially the last payment not being paid.
Yeah.
Title checks for outstanding, road test bills.
Yeah.
But it helps make a cleaner offer.
Yeah, so Lynette, in your case, if you're verifying with the title companies and you're doing the due diligence on behalf of your buyer, you're good. Not many agents take that extra time, so that's why that fail safe is put in here, right in the extra $250 or whatever. It's very easy to get their money back. I mean, if I choose, if I'm the seller and I don't want to pay my final bill, I can take it to the title company. The title company will pay the final bill and send me the balance of the money. Or if I choose to pay it, I can show the title company and they'll give me all my $250 back. So it's not that much of an inconvenience, but sometimes your offer can look better if you put a zero, to your point, Lynette. So you might put a zero in there. Sure it is. Yeah, absolutely. So in your case, absolutely, you can put a zero there and say, yes, I will verify that. It's Keller Williams. We're allowed to share Lynette. Tammy's asking, so how do we know what amount to put there? So typically I would do $250. That is typically what I see in there. If you start putting more than $250, and that could even be on the high side. I mean, my water bill at home is usually like $47 or less, or $43, whatever it is. So I can't imagine that they would need $250, but it's just a number that I've been used to for the entire time I've been practicing. You could put $100 in there if you wanted to. Or you could put zero to Lynette's point and then just call and verify that they're paid. So, yeah. Yeah, $250 wouldn't help with 7,000. Oh yeah, no, I think if I saw that a bill was $7,000 past due before I wrote an offer, I would make the offer contingent upon the seller paying that in full before closing, absolutely, or at closing. But I would make sure I was drawing attention to it to the title company, because that'd be a problem. Though I went on a listing appointment the one time, and it was a family friend, so I knew of them. We had been to parties together. I didn't know them very well, but I knew of them, and I went to their house, and I'm like, why does your sewer bill always end up on your tax bill? I mean, for years, they own this house for 10 years and it keeps going on their tax bill. And I said, why do you not just pay the sewer bill? And she goes, I thought that's just how it was supposed to be. It goes on our taxes and I pay it on my taxes. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. So it was quite interesting. Like, innocently enough, she did not realize that, but we had to make sure, because by the time your sewer water bill gets assessed to the taxes, it's pretty delinquent. It's a problem. And believe it or not, it can happen to where it's right at that time where they haven't reported it yet to the taxes, and you close on the home and the new owner gets the responsibility of it. So that's why, again, that's in there is to try and protect them. And then I had a client one time, and actually I can't even lie, this was a cousin, and I just couldn't believe it. I went to list her house, and I said, why don't you pay your sewer bill? And she said, well, they can't shut it off. I never thought of it that way, but I guess if there's a bill you don't want to pay, you're right. They can't shut your sewer off. So, you know, they can shut your water off, they can shut your electric off, but they can't shut your sewer off. So, okay, well, that was a learning curve. But if you pay all your bills, you're good, right? So, all right, and then the initials at the bottom of that one. Megan's Law, it is pretty much in almost every purchase agreement these days, but basically the thing to know is, and this is what I would say is, sellers are not obligated to always disclose depending upon what the sexual offender or predator is in their neighborhood, how close they are. Maybe they didn't get a letter. Maybe they you know, the postcard didn't come around. They're not aware of it, but maybe through the grapevine somehow, you know, the buyer is aware of it. They're like, oh, I have friends in that neighborhood. I know there's somebody that lives in that. Well, fine. Do not, you always want to be the source of the source. Don't tell them there is or isn't a sexual offender or predator in the neighborhood. Refer them to the sheriff's website in the county in which that property is. They can look on there. There is a map. Be scared, because there are a lot more sexual offenders in this world than you ever realize, whether it's on a mild scale where it was maybe a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, and unfortunately they got nabbed, you know, just before their 18th birthday and parents were involved or whatever, all the way up to the worst thing you can think of a sexual offender. I mean, when you look that up, there are tons of red dots all over a map, and you can be horrified. But let the buyer look that information up. You always want to make sure that they know and are aware of it. It's Megan's Law. If you, I'll segue. That's one thing, but what else it makes me think of is, I always get the question is, in Ohio, you legally do not have to disclose a suicide in a property. But I segue into that because I keep getting this question a lot, and I would just say to you, if a buyer ever came back to you or in a court and said, I would have never bought this house if I had known, whatever is in that blank, if I had known, whatever is after that, that could be a problem. So whether it's a sexual offender, whether it's a suicide or a death, you always want to make sure that you are disclosing anything that you could possibly imagine. I have had buyers that will walk into a house and they're like, has anybody ever died here? And I think that's an odd question, but it's legitimate and it bothers them. So I try and get that answered. And, you know, there are times where I ask the seller and they're like, no, not to their awareness. And then there's been times where they're like, yeah, my mother or my father or my grandparents or whatever, somebody passed away in their sleep peacefully. Oh, no, buyer is very sensitive to, I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, but they're very sensitive to ghosts and or whatever. And that's the way they feel, and that's okay. So if they were to go to court and be like, well, my agent didn't tell me that there was a sexual offender down the street, or my agent didn't refer me to this website, or my agent didn't do this, that could be a problem. So always disclose that. Were you gonna have a question?
Yeah, so if I'm at a property, sometimes I do it if I'm there by myself, like on the shared app, you can search the sex offenders and it brings it up. If a client asks me, am I allowed to show them this? And what if they grab my phone and they're like, okay, there's one next door. Am I giving them that information?
Well, you're being the source of the source.
Okay.
Your phone is, you're giving them your phone, but the source is coming from the Stark County, in that case, the Stark County. So you're being the source of the source, and that's fine. I would, though, follow up with an email that gives, you got to protect yourself. You got to protect you from being sued. And just because you're kind enough to bring it up on your phone and they say, oh, there's somebody that lives next door, maybe they go home 3 hours later and go, oh, that's okay, we're still going to buy the house. I would always follow up if it's a problem in an email, and maybe it's just part of your buyer presentation that you have it written somewhere, or in an email that you send to them that says, you know, if you have concerns, this is going to be coming up. So it's not a bad idea to put in your buyer presentation, Megan's Law. You could take this exact paragraph if you wanted to and put it in there, and then put the link to all the sheriff's departments that you work in that area. Yep. Yep. Damage or destruction. So line 95 through 102, damage or destruction of the property. Basically, the seller is responsible for any damage to that property until they no longer have possession. It gets to be a gray area when you have a closing on a property and the seller is still living in the house and something breaks. I say it's gray because nobody wants to claim that air conditioner that just broke, right? The seller's like, it's not mine. The buyer's like, well, yes, you're still there. In reality, once it closes, if the seller is still in possession of that house, they become a tenant. So they are not responsible for a hot water tank or a roof leak or anything. And it's going to be the buyer's insurance that covers it. So we've seen more and more agents getting away from possession after closing. I mean, it's been less and less each year. We still do it, but it's not recommended. But any damage or destruction to the property is the seller's responsibility. And if the damage is more than 10%, then the value of the home, the buyer can say, hey, I'm not going to move forward. Or if there's a storm and insurance is going to pay for it, the buyer has the decision to say, I'm going to walk away, or I'm going to take the insurance check and I'll get it fixed myself. So there's a few different ways. I don't know very many lenders that would still close on a house that had a roof torn off. You know, and the buyer's like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. I'll go ahead and take the insurance money and I'll fix it later. Oftentimes the lender's not going to close on that until it's fixed. But maybe there's, you know, a cash buyer or something like that. It could be. Condition of the property. So it just says that the buyers examined the condition of the property, and that with the exclusion of the residential property disclosure form, that they're accepting the property basically as it is. Even if they do an inspection, they can't bring up anything from the residential property disclosure form. That's what this says. Buyers do it all the time. You can say that there's a leaky basement, and all of a sudden you have a home inspection and that the buyer actually sees the water because it's raining. And then they'll say, oh, I don't want the house anymore. Well, technically they're not allowed to do that if it was disclosed on the property disclosure form, but they do it all the time. And the one thing that you'll learn in this business is, as much as you want to make a seller sell or a buyer buy, you can't force them to do it. So, the condition of the property is, hopefully they've examined it. Hopefully they've done a home inspection. Our buyer agency agreement will go into more detail on that as well. That will be a protection for you and the brokerage to say, hey, we recommend you get a home inspection. If you choose not to, just like this, that's up to you. But the condition of the property, we are not responsible for the condition of the property.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which of the boxes would be the better box to check? Receipt? I would assume that they received it even if.
Yeah. Yes. I do. And you make a perfect question. However, on line 113, it does go in, unless the sale of the property is exempt by Ohio Revised Code. So you would check actually box 111 if it is an exemption, simply because it does say unless the sale of the property is exempt. So that they wouldn't receive one. So it does say that they would unless it's exempt. So that's the one. Right, exactly. And the exemption form, just so you're aware, is not an Ohio real estate form. That is not from the Division of Real Estate. That is from Ohio Realtors. And the only reason that they did that form is in those cases where those 7 exemptions exist, that the buyer can say, oh, got it. Now I know why there's not an RPD filled out. It's a trustee, or it's, you know, exempt because the person's lived in the home for the last year, or whatever the case would be. But that is not a form that's required either. It is recommended, but it's not required.
Do. The person on the other side is just an agent. And we didn't have any of those forms. I mean, is there anything that we should do on our end to be compliant?
Okay, so say that again. So what do you mean the other side of the deal is an agent? Well, a seller would have to use, they may not have to use an exempt form, but they either have to use the RPD or they are exempt. Yeah, the bad thing is about the RPD is, honestly, it is a required form that must be filled out by all sellers. There is no consequence to a seller if they don't fill out the form, unless they are sued, and then perhaps there might be a reason for them that they harm themselves. But other than the buyer being able to walk away from the deal without being liable for any responsibility, the seller can't come after them or anything up until the very moment of closing before they sign the paperwork for not receiving the RPD. That's the only consequence that there is for a seller or a buyer. So when we say that you must fill out the RPD, we can't tell them how to fill it out. You know, they could cross out every single thing on there, an initial and date at the bottom of every page, and say, I've never lived in the house. I can't make them fill that out anymore. So we have seen where, like Cutler there for a while, they were saying, well, your seller missed this question, or your seller didn't fill this out. Have them do it. It's required. No, we cannot make them do anything when it comes to RPD. And it's frustrating. but we can't. So and really you shouldn't even be around. Like when they're filling out the RPD, if you're around, they're going to ask you a question. They're going to say something like, well, I haven't seen a lot of water in the basement since, I don't know, 1999. Sometimes it trickles in. What should I put? And they're looking for your help, and then you're culprit to the problem. So you don't really want to answer. So when you do have somebody fill out an RPD, you should really just say to them, you need to fill this out. If you have general questions, I will try and answer. However, I cannot help you fill out the form. So, all right. And then let's see here. We have seen where like lines 114 through 122, where there's been a gas leak in a front yard. And that's a problem, obviously, because who's going to pay for that? Who's responsible for it? Well, it says the seller is going to pay for any of those between the street and the foundation before closing. And we also have on there, or the restoration of utilities, whichever is sooner, because you're going to notice the market that we're going to get into, you're going to start to see some foreclosures, and you're going to make an offer on a property that doesn't have utilities on. And then when they're restored, there's a problem with a gas line or whatever. Well, the seller is responsible for that. And this just covers that. We haven't seen that in a long time, but it's coming back. And then basically the buyer shall assume repair obligations below $500 in the event that there are any, like a city or a township giving violations. Because we have also seen where forms have crossed either in the mail or whatever, and I'm getting ready to close on Scott's property, and Scott hasn't taken care of the property in 10 years, and the city has a laundry list of things that need to be done. And Scott was never served with the document before he goes to closing, but somehow all of a sudden I get it before I get to closing. And it's like, well, wait a minute, I'm not responsible for all of these problems. I didn't know they even existed. But if they're under $500, I'm taking on that responsibility. So Scott's off the hook. All right, and then and then inspections. So basically, again, this is here to try and protect us from getting in trouble, that we just say all buyers should do inspections. They have the right to do as many inspections as they want to do. It does need to be an Ohio licensed home inspector. It cannot just be grandpa, uncle, dad, whatever. Anybody that's receiving a fee or anything of value to do a home inspection, they must be licensed. And that's the biggest thing to remember. So, even if you're giving out information to a buyer and your home inspector is not licensed, you're going to be in trouble for that. So you can go on the division website, the e-license lookup, and you can find out all the inspectors that are licensed or not licensed. I can pretty much assure you there are still home inspectors out there that are not licensed, that are still doing work or doing things they shouldn't be doing because they didn't want to go through the process. All right. Line 136, where it says the waiver and initials. So that's just saying you want to make sure your buyer or buyers initial that, because you want to make sure that they understand that all of the boxes they've checked no to, that they don't have a right to do those inspections anymore. So if you have a buyer that says, well, I think I might want to do a mold inspection, but I'm going to wait until after the home inspection, then you need to check yes on the mold inspection. If they're unsure whether they want to do a pest inspection until after the home inspection, but yes, they do want to do it. So in those cases, I would put general home inspection, yes, within 7 days from acceptance of the agreement, and my buyer is going to pay for it. And then I might put for the mold and pest, I might put 14 days that I have. And then that way, if my buyer decides they do want them, they can still have them within that 14-day period after the home inspection. But if they don't want them, I can waive them and say, no, you know what, based on the home inspection, my buyer has decided to waive those inspections. But what you don't want to do is what has been done to us many times, is where a home inspector will upsell a radon inspection or do whatever, and it's a vacant house that you don't even go to, and a seller isn't going home to. Perhaps they are, but more often than not, they don't. And all of a sudden, 2 days later, you get a radon inspection report, or the buyer said, or the listing agent. My gosh, I'm so confused. The seller says there is a device in my home and somebody wants to come back and collect it. And you're like, wait a minute, you didn't have the right to put that in there. And then they send you the report and it's above 4. And then you say, well, now we have to mitigate. So you need to have those conversations with your buyers to make sure that, if they want the inspection, check yes, we can waive it later, but you can't go back and say, yes, I want it after you said no.
One of the big ones is the drain scope.
Yeah, the drain scope is huge. Pay attention to some of the purchase agreements. I mean, ours, we don't have the drain scope in there, but that is what line 149 is for. You can check the other box and you can put in there whether you want a pool inspection, roof inspection, and HVAC inspection, you know, as many other inspections as you want to do. You have that capability of putting it in there. But there are some other purchase agreements that will say, like, for example, the ones from Columbus, if you ever see one from the Columbus market, there are no boxes to check. The buyer is allowed to do any and all inspections that they want to do. They don't need your permission. When they have 14 days or 7 days to do inspections, they can call in whoever they want and do as many as they want. So when you're on the listing side, you definitely want to make sure you read through the purchase agreement and find out what they're doing. But for ours, we are very clear in Northeastern Ohio what inspections are being done. So. Yeah. So this is what I'm battling. I'll just be very, very frank with you. Realtors are entrepreneurs and they don't like to be told what to do. Okay. The contract that we would have would be 14 pages long because it's from Ohio Realtors. That would be the contract. If I gave you a 14-page purchase agreement versus our 7-page purchase agreement, you may not have very nice words for me. Your buyers are probably not going to have very nice words for you. We have held off as long as we can, and I continue to hold off on that. I imagine there will become a day where Northeast Ohio will end up, or Ohio as a whole will end up with one purchase agreement that is mandatory to be used. And I say that simply because, just like I talked to you about the addendum, the one-page counteroffer addendum that comes out of the Mansfield brokerage. I was not aware of it as your broker. The agent was not aware of it. No other agent in our brokerage was aware of it, nor was any other broker in our area aware of it that I asked. That's a problem because we are supposed to be the most competent people when it comes to helping a consumer buy or sell their home. And if we don't know all of our contracts verbatim, then unfortunately that's a problem. And so I don't know if we'll ever get to that point. I imagine that we will with the way the lawsuits are going and things like that. But for now, we are really, and when I say we, the leadership, we are trying our darndest to hold off on bringing all these documents because you're going to see, there's already going to be another one. A buyer broker compensation agreement is going to be added to this at the end of, or August 17th. It's going to be a required form too. So we just keep adding forms, but it's a CYA world. Like we have to do these things. So I do not see us doing that until we absolutely have to. Just, yeah. In Northeast Ohio is not ready for it, to be quite frank with you. Our purchase agreement is very similar to most Northeast Ohio purchase agreements. You could almost take the state of Ohio and put it in 4 quadrants. And we are used to our area's purchase agreements. That's what we're used to. So Tammy's asking, so how do we know amount to put in there? Nope, that one was at 113. Damiano says hello, question mark. We are here if you can hear me. I mean, just type in here. All right, we'll continue on here. So you'll see that the buyer and seller's expense, I'll cover a little bit of this. We don't often see it's a seller's expense anymore. I've seen where a pest inspection was a common thing that a seller used to pay. I've seen where septic and well used to be a common thing that a seller would pay. In the market that we've been in, it's just not common. Buyers paying for everything. I've even seen where a buyer's agent at DHOF, she had written that the buyer is willing to pay the seller's closing costs just to get the contract accepted. Yeah. So, I mean,
it has to be fair. Some people still don't realize the VA does not require them to have to get it. Some people still think that
the VA can't pay it. Yeah. Yeah. Veterans are now allowed to pay your commission and they're also allowed to pay for a pest inspection.
No, they can't. 2 years.
They can. That's why I said they can now pay your commission and they can also pay for pest inspection. But yeah, that changed a while ago, the pest inspection part of it. But yeah, but it is 100% negotiable. So you can put in there. One of the things I guess I should just mention is while we have the time is line 145, the radon. This can be a little bit confusing. I would say typically the radon right now we're seeing, I think agents putting between 7 and 10 days for inspections period. I can remember a time where there were 14 days. So it's all negotiable, but the more aggressive you want to be with your offer, the less days you can have there. But on the radon, even if the buyer is paying for it, seller, it doesn't matter. As we go through that, where it says that if 4 picocuries per liter or more, seller to mitigate at a cost not to exceed blank. Typically, I see in there, and you guys might know better than I have. I haven't had to do a radon mitigation in a while, but is $1,000 still close, or is it more 1,200? What do you see?
Seen as high as 1,500.
You've seen as size 15. Okay.
It used to say between 8 and 1,200.
Yeah.
Right now, it's 1,000 to 1,500.
Okay. So you might want to put 1,200 or 1,500 in there. Then that would be the case. And it would also be on the next line where it says of mitigation costs in excess of 1,500, if that's what you're putting within blank days of receipt, either buyer or seller may terminate this contract, because if it's above that, who's going to pay for it, right? The seller. I have seen instances where a basement, maybe a house was added on to, there are 2 different basement spaces, or a large enough basement space where you either need a bigger fan, bigger motor for that, or you need 2 different systems in there in order to get the radon out. I just had the highest radon level I've ever seen, and I'm sure people have seen higher, but it was at like, I want to say it was 87 or 86 in Akron. And I thought, holy Toledo. And this is a walkout basement. Like the garage is in there and everything. When we got to the house, the basement window was open the whole time that we looked at the showing and everything. And when we came back for the inspections, it was still open, and we had told them to close it, but they didn't. Well, you could clearly see from the time that the inspector placed the monitor in there, because I had closed the window, that it was, lower. It still wasn't low, but it was lower. And then it just climbed exponentially because that window was closed. And I mean, it's crazy enough when you come back with 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever, but 86 or 87 it was. I just thought, holy Toledo. So it was interesting, but I'm sure there's been higher. That was just different for me. Damiano says no, but I think it's my computer, not you. Okay. All right. This is recorded, so we can always share. Not that he can hear me, so I'm talking to him like he can hear me, but nonetheless. So you might put 1,200, 1,500, something like that in there. I will also tell you that, on Jose's team, I know from working with Rachel, even when I've been the buyer's agent, and I've written it in there, they kind of have a policy where they won't pay the whole thing. They recommend to their sellers that they pay half of the mitigation. And that we changed the contract because that's what they recommend to their sellers. So you can negotiate it any way that you want to. All right. And then within the 3 days after completion, and this is so important, you've got to provide a release of contingency. Cutler is the only company in our area that does not use an ROC. Everybody else uses an ROC. They only use addendums. Jay Cutler has a whole reason of why they don't, but we all practice that we have an ROC. And if you don't provide it in those 3 days, your seller could the seller could make this null and void, this contract, if they really wanted to. You've really got to pay attention to these dates. So you have to, within 3 days of the completion of the last inspection, and like I said, we're going to put a definition of completion in there. That's you getting the paperwork back, or the buyer being presented with the paperwork. Simply because it is not because a septic inspector or a well inspector goes out that they're completed. They're not completed until they actually send that water sample in and get the results back, or the septic goes to the county and is approved or disapproved or needs repairs or whatever the case would be. But if you don't provide the ROC, you could harm your buyer. And then once you provide the ROC, if you and the seller do not identify, or the listing agent and you as the buyer's agent don't identify all the things that you are agreeing to and sign it within 5 days, it also could make the contract null and void. And it's written in here. And I've seen plenty of times where, like Michael, you had mentioned earlier something about repairs, or Scott, you did, one of you. One of the things I will tell you is I see oftentimes where agents will say, well, I sent the ROC, but now the seller wants to get repairs on the roof or the plumbing or whatever, so we haven't done anything, and now it's been beyond 5 days. Well, technically, you're out of contract. Legally, you're out of contract. And so what you would want to do in those instances is do an addendum that extends the inspection period or extends the ROC period to say, we have until this date to get a fully executed ROC and make agreements. I've also had agents call and say, well, Scott sent me over an ROC that lists the laundry list of things to do. My seller doesn't want to do anything. And since my seller doesn't want to do anything, can we just get out of the contract and move on to the next deal? The answer is no. Just because I ask for something, or Scott's buyer asks for something, The seller could say, no, I don't want to do it. If I go back to Scott and his buyer and say, my seller doesn't want to do it, and the buyer goes, oh, okay, I thought I'd ask anyway, but I'll buy it just the way it is, you still have a contract. But there are loopholes that agents think that they have and try and get out, or sellers, and those are not good loopholes. That it doesn't work that way. So, and the only way it would work is if you in fact could not or do not get the ROC signed within that 5 days. Yeah, Damiano, you are welcome to, there's a recording after, we'll make sure that you get it. All right, and the buyer has the opportunity to terminate the agreement. They can accept it with the seller making repairs, or they can just remove the contingencies altogether and move forward with the house just the way it is. Home warranty policy. This would just say, yes, you do want a home warranty. No, you don't want a home warranty. Who's paying for it and what's the cost? So we have America's Preferred Home Warranty. I think we still might have some 210 things around. I'm not quite sure. I know that they're not a preferred vendor of ours anymore because we do have an agreement with America's Preferred. So either company that you want to work with is absolutely fine. You do get paid, I think it's $100 for America's Preferred. That goes to you. It is not for selling the warranty. The only way you're getting that is if you actually go online or on paper and you fill out the description of the appliances, what make and model they are. Otherwise, that's the service you're getting paid. It is not for selling the warranty. So if you go ahead. They don't ask you to do that. There is
You still have to fill out their doc-
yes.
You can use their portal.
Their portal makes it very easy, which is wonderful. So you don't have to do the paper anymore, but you do have to go on the portal and fill out the information. But that's the service you're getting paid for. If you don't do that, if you just sell the warranty and you don't go on the portal and register and fill out that, you're not getting paid because it's a violation that they cannot pay you for the service as far as selling. Okay. All right. Deposit. So this is huge. I think it's interesting. We have it in our purchase agreement, but this is Ohio law. We're just following the law. The reason that we have the purchase agreement, the deposit, is simply because if we don't say to a title company, they don't have to follow the same rules as brokers, right? This is a broker law. So if the title company doesn't ever get a mutual release and has never been taken to court by the buyer or seller to get their earnest money back, or earnest money dispersed, I should say, they could hold on to it forever, right? Nobody wants to do that. We stopped holding earnest money because we had over $40,000 of unclaimed money that we had to go through and try and figure out whose money was what. Jose purchased the brokerage in 2016. We inherited that problem, right? So there is still money that we have no idea whose it is, and we're not accountable for it because we don't have records for it. We don't want to do that to somebody. There's no sense in tying up whether it's $500 or $5,000 of somebody's money. So this just clearly states, and this is, I say this all the time, I get earnest money questions, honest to goodness, you can come up with a million different scenarios. The worst case scenario you can think of. The law is the law is the law. If there is not a mutual release sign saying where that earnest money goes to be released to, we cannot release it. Neither is the title company going to release it. If a buyer or seller doesn't take the other one to court and have a final court order, they're not releasing it. And the only way they're releasing it then is upon a successful closing, or if after 2 years, neither party has taken the other one to court, or neither party has signed the mutual release, then the money will go back to the buyer or whoever wrote the check. If it's buyer's parents, uncles, whatever, they will get the money back. And worst case, if they can't find that individual, then unfortunately it goes to the state of Ohio in unclaimed funds in that person's name. Doesn't matter. There's no other scenario you can come up with to try and get that changed. That is what it is. So buyers can be as angry as they want. You need to explain to them they're not getting that earnest money back. These are the ways to do it. If it's tenant occupied, if the property is, that it just says that the seller shall prorate the rent and as of the date of closing, and all security deposits and leases shall be assigned to the buyer. This is something that you really want to pay attention to because this purchase agreement is good up from a 1-family home up to a 4-family home. So that is considered residential real estate. Anything over 5 units is then considered commercial. So the reason I bring that up is because there are often times where a seller doesn't collect a security deposit, or we've had instances where the seller did collect a security deposit, claims they didn't, but the tenant has a record of them giving a security deposit. We've also had it to where a buyer's agent has relied on the listing agent's testimony to say, oh yeah, they're on a month-to-month tenancy, or the rent is this. And then all of a sudden at closing table, we get a lease that says something totally different. So I would just say to you, take it very seriously when you have a tenant occupied property, because you can get burned on it, or your buyer can get burned, and they're not going to be happy with us when we didn't look out for them. So make sure on your settlement statement, if there is a tenant occupied unit, that you're getting all of those deposits or prorated rents. Okay.
Getting it right, but we always ask for any lease agreements, if they say they have, then we can come back on it, and if they do have it, because we have it right in our statement.
Yeah, you should always have everything in, you're right, absolutely get it in writing. And there are a lot of times where a seller says, I don't have a lease, and they do, because they just don't want to give it. Or they say, I didn't receive a security deposit, but they did, because they don't want to transfer it. Yeah, so it's a problem. And then contingent lines 188 or 194 would just be if it's contingent upon a buyer's current property being under contract. If their current property is not under contract and they have to close on it before they close on a new property, you're not using this paragraph at all. You would use a contingency or concurrency addendum. You would not fill this out. This is only if their property is presently under contract. Okay. And then the walkthrough addendum is already built into our purchase agreement. You don't have to do a separate one. The buyer has the right to do a walkthrough within 1 to 3 days prior to the date of closing, and it's just for the purpose of verifying the property is in the same condition as when they made the offer. One of the things I will say is the resolution for something, when you go to a house and there is a problem, the resolution is not, well, we're not closing on the property. Believe it or not, your buyer actually can become in breach of the contract because they're saying, well, I'm not going to close on the property on the specified date because I think this has changed, whatever this would be. From the time I made the offer until now. What you have to do is you actually need to put it in writing. So in the event that the buyer finds a material change in the condition of the property, then the buyer shall promptly notify the seller, and the parties shall mutually agree in writing upon a dollar amount to be held in escrow from the seller's proceeds pending the correction of the problem or credited to the buyer at closing. It doesn't say that the buyer has the opportunity not to close on the property. And that's more often than not what the buyer wants to do, is they want to threaten that they're not going to close until the seller takes care of something. So just know that that's not in your client's best interest. Try and get whatever resolved as fast as you can within the closing date. There is nothing that says that you can't extend the closing in writing while the seller gets things repaired, but you would not just say, I'm not closing. Okay. And then any additional terms that you can think of, such as, for example, we're going to have the addendum, but let's just say in your offer, your buyer's instructing you at this point to say, hey, you need to ask for $3,000 of concessions for your commission. Now that should go on the first page like we talked about, but let's just say it's not there. You put 0 in there because the buyer's not asking for concessions for themselves. It'd still be concessions if you're getting the commission from the seller, but you could write in on additional terms if you wanted to instead, to say seller agrees to pay $3,000 of buyer's agent's commission or something like that. I would try and stay away from that as much as possible. I would use the front page in the concession section, because that way it doesn't call out that the seller is being requested to pay your commission instead of just fees for the buyer. So, all right, duration and acceptance of the offer, that just says that your offer expires at the time that you put in there. You don't have to put a time in there, but be careful, because if you do put a date and time in there, the seller does not have to look at your offer after that time has expired. And if they do accept it, let's say, for example, you put an expiration date in there and the expiration time and date passes, you and your buyer can go out and look at another house. If the seller signs it after that, your buyer doesn't have to say, oh yeah, I'm still locked into this house, because they're not. They're no longer locked in after that time expires. And then authorization, it just says that we are going to get those escrow information from the title company so we can verify our settlement statements. And then it is a binding agreement. It's all in bold letters. Nobody reads it. Nobody pays attention to it, but it is a binding agreement on lines 217 through 224. We do have in there on line 216, that's 295 is our transaction or additional commission charge. Some of your teams or groups may charge more than that. You may be crossing that out and adding to it or what have you. I will tell you that we're wrestling with leaving it blank at the moment. I've got to finish this up. Well, I've got a call, not a call, but a meeting with the ALC at the end of this month to try and get their feedback as well. I solicit your feedback to say the same. But our attorney is basically saying, hey, if you have a printed version of your contract and it says 295, you really shouldn't have 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of your contract where one says 495, one says 295. If you leave it blank, all commission is negotiable, this is an additional commission, the agent can fill it in. My only hesitation with that, which we may have to go to, is simply that if you don't fill it in and you put 0 or you just leave it blank, then unfortunately you're going to have $195 missing out of your commission. Or $295, yeah. Well, no, we wouldn't take the whole thing if you're on the 70-30 plan. We would only take, but if you're on the 80-20, we're taking the whole thing. And that's my hesitation is, we don't want to harm the agent, but at the same time, we also can't harm the brokerage because people want to charge different commissions. From your lips to God's ears, Scott. So, ooh, our next broker coming up through the ranks here. Look out. All right, and then confidentiality. Basically, anything that your buyer doesn't want the seller to know, you shouldn't be sharing, or the listing agent to know. But one of the biggest misconceptions is, and that's what this talks about, is once you give your offer to the seller nor the listing agent has any duty of confidentiality. If Scott gives me an offer for $300,000 and my property is listed at 320, I, as the listing agent or the seller, can blast it out there on any social media and say, hey, I'm shopping offers. I've got an offer for $300,000. If you can beat it, the house is yours. Now, the buyer and the buyer's agent are going to be quite miffed about that, but it is 100% legal for the seller to do that. So your buyer does not have to, or they should understand rather, that it's not confidential.
They just have to make sure that listing agent has permission from the seller.
Oh yeah, you definitely have to have the seller's permission for almost anything you do. Yeah, well, everything you do, I guess I should say, not almost. And then .loop, cloud-based, we're using that. Dower interest, state of Ohio, I don't remember the other state now, was Arkansas. Okay, Arkansas. We have 2 out of the entire country that still have dower rights. I've talked to Ohio realtors extensively and the Ohio legislature. This isn't even anywhere on their radar. Don't care about it. We're going to have dower rights for probably a long time. Basically, it just says that the seller's spouse must sign this agreement. I can't tell you how many times that I've seen in my career where an agent doesn't get the seller's, or, a listing agent doesn't get both of the married couple signatures. It's a divorce situation. The spouse says, nope, I'm not moving. I'm not selling my house for that. You get all the way to closing and you've got a problem. Well, we can be sued for that. And so can you, and so can the seller, because we made a property available out there online and solicited a buyer for it, accepted their offer. They went through the whole process of paying for appraisals or inspections, whatever. And now we can't close on it simply because we didn't do our job, which is get the spouse's signature on our purchase agreement.
Is it possible to protect ourselves more as we're looking at this, that there's some kind of documentation that says that they are not legally married to somebody who don't have a spouse? That would protect us and our broker.
I mean, I guess on the listing agreement, we could put something in there, or you could write under additional terms.
It just seems like it would be a no-brainer if it's a simple way to protect our brokerage a little bit better.
Well, yes, that's true. So
I've had somebody say to me, I'm not married. Then they get through title and they're like, actually, Scott, they're married. What?
yeah.
Wait,
yeah.
And that's what I mean.
Well, buyers are liars, and they will say they're not married when they are. They fill out paperwork for title and say that they're not married as a seller or whatever, thinking that they're not going to have to sign, and they do. I mean, we could look at that and see on the listing agreement. I will say for the purchase agreement, it's not necessarily going to do any good, simply because if it's not our listing, we have no idea. What's that?
It takes one to buy.
Yes, it only takes one to buy. That's right. But on our purchase agreement, this is saying that the seller's spouse must sign, because even though it takes one buyer to buy, it does take 2 sellers to sell if they're married. And that's why it says on here the seller must sign, because unfortunately it's like, so you and Lynette, you're not getting along. You sign the purchase agreement and all of a sudden she's like, no, I'm not selling my house for that. Listen, I'm listening to Lynette. Whatever's happening, I'm on Lynette's side. So. Yeah, she may have signed off dower when they closed on the house. I have seen that before. When there's a loan in place, it is signed off. If the seller has the documentation, which oftentimes they probably don't because it's been however long since they closed, you would have that to give to the title company. I don't know anybody else that would have it other than the lender of the original documents, and that's if they still have it, because maybe they've refinanced, maybe that other loan is paid off. you just don't know. So, I mean, the title company is not really going to be able to tell unless the mortgage was recorded and it's in those documents. But again, if they refinanced, we don't know that they signed off of the refinance. So it's kind of iffy. But it could be true. It could be where a seller really did sign off at closing. Um, I'm sorry, they were a buyer at that time, but they signed off dower and now they're selling. But there's also no harm in the other person signing unless they're absolutely emphatic about them not signing because they don't like their spouse all of a sudden and they just refuse to sign. That could be the case, but I would still try and get their signature if you can. Yeah. And worst case scenario, the reason we say must, it doesn't invalidate the purchase agreement if they don't. What we're trying to protect is getting to closing and them saying, I'm not closing. That's what we're trying to protect. So, yeah, I mean, if you can't get them to sign the purchase agreement, then I guess you can't, but try. Yeah. So if it's our listing, then in that case, I would definitely get this both of the sellers on the listing agreement. If again somebody's emphatic that they won't, I would say you would want to somehow make sure that that is in fact true 100%, because if they won't sign the listing agreement, chances are they're not signing at closing. Just my thought. All right, and then the addendums that go along with the purchase agreement, you can always check those boxes, and then buyer signature, and then all the information there. Does anybody have any general questions? Yep. Yeah. Right. So Lynette's question is, for those of you online, if the expiration date, duration of acceptance of the offer, let's say it's today at 12 o'clock and the seller signs the offer at 1:30. As long as the buyer wants to accept that offer back at 1:30, then that's fine. But it's in there because you might have an out-of-state buyer that comes in and says, I want to write an offer on 2 houses. And we're going to say, well, you really can't do that because you could buy 2 houses. And they'll say, well, I'm leaving to go back to California and I need a house. All right, great. Well, what house number 1 do you want? All right, we're going to make this offer good until 5 o'clock today. And if they don't sign it, I'll submit your other offer, and that's good till 5 o'clock tomorrow. Then you're good. Now, if the seller comes back at 7 o'clock tonight and says, hey, I'm good with that, and the other people haven't accepted this other offer, then you could typically say, okay, we're withdrawing our offer from you and we're accepting this first offer. But it can be dangerous. So yeah.
Then at what point does the seller come back and sign?
Right. If you didn't withdraw it, right. Well, it could expire, but I mean, I would say that'd be a gray area. You're absolutely right. Right. If you didn't put a duration in there, yeah, you left an open offer forever, basically. But that's why we have the duration of the time in there. So, I mean, I wouldn't recommend leaving it blank, and that doesn't often happen, but it could. Absolutely could. Yeah, you should always put a date and time in there. I mean, it needs to be explained to the buyer what's happening, but yeah. Okay. Anybody on Zoom have any questions? You're not on Zoom. All right, we're gonna let the class on Zoom go. You guys have a good day. Oh, wait, is there somebody? Yep, okay. Go ahead. Okay.